Here's a sentence no American president has ever said before. It has been my honor to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th. Donald Trump posted that on Truth Social on Thursday evening alongside the announcement of a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, the first meaningful halt to that particular front since the war dragged Lebanon in when Hezbollah fired on Israel 6 weeks ago. He invited Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and Lebanon's President Aoun to the White House for talks. He said both sides want peace. He said it would happen quickly. And from the outside, looking at the map, it looks, actually genuinely, like something remarkable is happening. The Israel-Lebanon-Washington summit happened on Tuesday, the first direct talks in 40 years, a ceasefire brokered by Thursday, White House meetings being planned, second U.S.-Iran talks reportedly imminent, the naval blockade holding, the ceasefire with Iran still, technically, in place. From a certain angle, this looks like a peace process. But here's what CNN's satellite analysis team found when they pointed their cameras at Iran's underground missile bases while everyone was watching Trump's Truth Social posts. In the satellite images, taken on April 10th, during the ceasefire, front-end loaders are scooping rubble, dump trucks are removing debris, tunnels that U.S. and Israeli bombs spent 47 days sealing shut are being dug out, engineering crews are working around the clock, Iran's missile cities, the underground bunker networks housing its ballistic missile launchers, are being restored. The capabilities America spent billions trying to destroy are being rebuilt, on our watch, during the ceasefire. While the world is focused on Lebanon, this series of events has rapidly evolved into the most complex, layered, and potentially dangerous diplomatic moment of the entire war. Because what you are witnessing is not simply a peace process. It is a race between the diplomacy that could end this war and the military reconstitution that could make the next round of it far more destructive than the last. What happens over the next 5 days, before the April 21st ceasefire deadline, could fundamentally change everything, and the world is simply not ready for what either outcome brings. Welcome. Today's briefing is Operation 10th Ceasefire, named directly after Trump's own claim. But unlike the celebration the name implies, today's script is a sober, sourced war game of what this ceasefire actually achieves, what Iran is doing during it, whether the second round of U.S.-Iran talks can close the nuclear gap before April 21st, and why the most important number in today's story is not 10, it is 47 days, because that is how long Iran has had to study American military tactics, map U.S. vulnerabilities, and begin rebuilding what was destroyed. Everything you hear today is verified across 16 major international outlets. The story is extraordinary. Let's build the picture. Per Axios's detailed reconstruction of how Thursday's ceasefire came together, it was Trump who pushed it through, not Netanyahu and not Lebanon. The sequence was remarkable. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted the rare Israel-Lebanon meeting in Washington on Tuesday, the first direct high-level engagement between the two countries since 1993. The ceasefire was discussed. No decisions were made. As Israel's security cabinet convened on Wednesday evening to discuss Lebanon, they were debating options when, per Axios's senior Israeli official source, Trump pushed this ceasefire through. Ministers heard about Trump's Truth Social announcement several minutes into the call and before any serious discussion had started. In other words, Netanyahu's security cabinet was mid-meeting when their American ally announced a ceasefire on social media without waiting for their vote. The reason Trump moved so decisively and unilaterally is confirmed by Axios's analysis. The Lebanon ceasefire was not just about Lebanon, it was about Iran. Iran had been insisting throughout the Islamabad talks that any permanent deal with the United States must include a halt to Israeli strikes on Hezbollah. By securing a 10-day Lebanon ceasefire independently of the Iran negotiations, Trump removed one of Tehran's core preconditions for returning to the table. Without having to concede it in a nuclear framework agreement, it was a tactical diplomatic decoupling. Lebanon ceasefire here, Iran nuclear talks there, with the Hormuz blockade providing ongoing economic pressure throughout. Per Aoun and NBC News, Trump will now invite both Netanyahu and Lebanon's President Aoun to the White House for the first meaningful talks between Israel and Lebanon since 1983. He has directed J.D. Vance and Secretary Rubio, alongside Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, to work toward lasting peace. It is the most ambitious diplomatic architecture attempted in the Middle East since the Abraham Accords. Let me be direct about something the celebratory framing obscures. The Lebanon ceasefire is 10 days, just 10. That is not a peace deal. It is a cooling-off period designed to give the Iran negotiations space to breathe before the April 21st U.S.-Iran ceasefire deadline. Israel has not agreed to withdraw from southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has not agreed to disarm. The 2,124 Lebanese deaths and the over 1 million displaced have not produced an agreement on the fundamental question of whether Hezbollah continues to exist as an armed force inside Lebanese territory. The White House summit will be the beginning of something, not the end. Whether Netanyahu, who faces enormous pressure from his right flank to finish the job, can hold a ceasefire for 10 days without a catastrophic Hezbollah provocation, or without one of his own ministers acting unilaterally, is the question that should be keeping every diplomat in Washington awake tonight. This is the story. Not the Lebanon ceasefire. Not the second Iran talks. This. Per CNN's satellite imaging investigation, confirmed by Israel Aoun and weapons analysts at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, Iran has been spending the ceasefire period systematically unblocking the entrances to its underground missile infrastructure. The U.S. and Israeli bombing campaign spent 47 days and enormous precision munitions capacity specifically targeting the tunnel entrances to Iran's missile cities, the hardened underground complexes from which ballistic missile launchers deploy to fire and retreat. The operational concept was explicit. If you can't destroy the missiles themselves, you bury the launchers underground so they cannot exit to fire. U.S. intelligence assessed that roughly half of Iran's missile launchers remained intact after a month of fighting, but many were physically trapped underground by collapsed or debris-blocked tunnel entrances. During the ceasefire, satellite images show Iran deploying engineering equipment, front-end loaders, dump trucks, excavators, at multiple missile-based locations to clear those entrances. The work is visible, it is ongoing, and it is militarily significant. As weapons analyst Sam Lair told CNN, a ceasefire requires you to accept that your adversary is going to reconstitute some of their military capacity that you just spent a bunch of time and effort and money destroying. That is the polite version. The direct version is this. Every day the ceasefire holds without a nuclear deal being signed is a day Iran rebuilds the military capability the bombing campaign degraded. The 90% reduction in Iranian missile launch rates that U.S. intelligence celebrated by day 10 of the war was a product of suppressed launchers and depleted stocks. It was not a permanent achievement. It was a temporary degradation that the ceasefire is now allowing Iran to reverse. Here is the strategic implication that nobody is saying plainly enough. If the April 21st ceasefire deadline passes without a deal, and if the U.S. and Israel are forced to resume strikes, they will be striking at an Iranian missile infrastructure that is measurably more capable than the one they left at the ceasefire's start. The 47-day bombing campaign's gains are being eroded, not dramatically, not completely, but meaningfully, by every day of ceasefire without a nuclear framework. This is not speculation, it is in the satellite imagery, and it fundamentally changes the calculation for both the U.S. negotiating team, who must close a deal before Iran's military reconstitution reaches strategic significance, and the Israeli military, which has the most direct interest in preventing that reconstitution from completing. Per CNN's confirmed reporting, Bloomberg and Time, U.S. and Iranian teams are in active discussions about a second round of in-person talks. Pakistan has proposed Islamabad again. Geneva and Istanbul are also on the table. The objective, per all sources, is to hold the meeting before the April 21st ceasefire expiry. J.D. Vance is expected to lead the U.S. delegation again. The specific nuclear gap, per CNN's reporting on the Islamabad sessions, is this. The U.S. proposed a 20-year moratorium on uranium enrichment. Iran proposed 5 years. The gap between those numbers is 15 years. Per analysis from CFR's James Lindsay, both sides face domestic political constraints that make dramatic concessions difficult. Iran's new supreme leader has to show the IRGC and hardliners that the ceasefire was not a capitulation. Trump has to show the U.S. Senate that the deal prevents nuclear breakout for a credible period. The emerging compromise territory, per diplomatic sources cited by Bloomberg and CNN, is a number somewhere between 8 and 12 years, potentially with a review mechanism after 7 years, subject to verified compliance. Combined with phased sanctions relief, a Hormuz reopening protocol, and a Lebanon ceasefire extension, this could form the architecture of an Islamabad MOU, the framework agreement that Araghchi said was inches away when the first round collapsed. Layer 4. The Houthis, the blockade, and the pressure that is actually working. Per Press TV, the Houthis declared that the U.S. ceasefire with Iran was agreed after defeat, framing the entire diplomatic process as an Iranian victory. That framing matters because the Houthis, who have been conspicuously restrained since February 28th, are watching every negotiating signal for cues about whether to reactivate at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. If the second round of talks fails, and if resumed U.S. strikes on Iran trigger a full IRGC escalation order, the Houthi question becomes critical again. Meanwhile, the U.S. naval blockade, despite sanctioned ships passing through on day one, appears to be having its intended psychological effect. Per Time and the White House sources, Iran called the U.S. on Monday to say they want to make a deal very badly. The blockade is not strangling Iran's economy in 4 days, but it is demonstrating U.S. willingness to impose further costs, which is a precondition for any credible negotiating leverage. Scenario 1 is the one that the Lebanon ceasefire was designed to enable, by removing the Lebanon question from the Iran nuclear negotiation, decoupling it as Trump did on Thursday. The U.S. has narrowed the agenda for the second round of talks to its 2 core items: nuclear enrichment timeline and Hormuz sovereignty. If both sides can find a number between 8 and 12 years on enrichment and agree to a Hormuz reopening protocol that gives Iran face-saving coordination language rather than explicit surrender, the framework MOU can be signed before April 21st. The ceasefire extends. The blockade lifts in stages. Oil prices fall toward $85. Netanyahu and Aoun come to the White House, and Trump does, genuinely, get to announce his 10th ceasefire, this time with the nuclear clause that makes it meaningful. The decisive factor in this scenario is whether the Iranian delegation that arrives at the second round has actual authority from Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei to accept a number in the 8 to 12-year range. At Islamabad, per Vance's own assessment, the Iranian team was not in a position to cut a deal and had to return to Tehran for approval. If the second round includes negotiators with full authority, the gap closes much faster. Scenario 2 is the one that the Missile City satellite imagery makes newly dangerous. If the April 21st deadline arrives without a framework agreement, the U.S. resumes strikes. But the target set has changed. Iranian missile launchers that were trapped underground by debris are now, in some number, being freed. The reconstitution is not complete. Intelligence assessments suggest partial restoration over the ceasefire period, but it is meaningful. The second round of strikes will face a more capable Iranian missile defense than existed on April 7th. That means more sophisticated countermeasures, more effective IRGC resistance, and potentially higher American casualties. The force projection calculus shifts. This is the scenario that should be driving urgency in the second round talks, and maybe behind closed doors. If you want to track every development of the second round talks, every satellite image, every diplomatic signal, every ceasefire extension update, subscribe to this channel right now. We are covering all of it. Now, Scenario 3. Scenario 3 is the historically underestimated one, the White House summit between Netanyahu and Aoun that Trump has announced. The last meaningful talks between Israel and Lebanon were in 1983. The last formal peace framework attempt between Israel and Lebanon was the May 17th agreement of 1983, which collapsed within a year under Syrian and Hezbollah pressure. This time, the geopolitical landscape is fundamentally different. Hezbollah is militarily weakened. The Lebanese government has sought to disarm Hezbollah since 2024. Syria is no longer a hostile state sponsor blocking Lebanese sovereignty, and the U.S. has military force projection in the region at historic levels. If the White House summit produces even a preliminary framework, Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon tied to a Hezbollah disarmament timeline with U.S.-backed enforcement mechanisms, it would be one of the most consequential Middle East agreements in a generation. Combined with an Iran nuclear deal, it would remove the 2 primary drivers of regional instability simultaneously. That is the grand deal that Vance described as the objective, and for the first time in decades, the conditions for it are partially present. This is the scenario that every optimistic framing of Thursday's announcement elides. The 10-day Lebanon ceasefire is politically sensitive for Netanyahu. His right flank ministers, some of whom learned about it from a social media post mid-cabinet meeting, have not endorsed the deal. Hezbollah has not agreed to disarm. If a single significant Hezbollah rocket hits an Israeli city during the 10-day ceasefire window, domestic political pressure on Netanyahu to respond will be overwhelming. And Netanyahu, facing his own electoral challenges, cannot be assumed to resist it. One broken ceasefire in Lebanon collapses the entire diplomatic architecture. Iran walks away from second-round talks, citing Israeli aggression. The April 21st deadline passes. The blockade intensifies. The Houthis reactivate, and the war restarts, against an Iran that has spent the ceasefire period rebuilding its missile cities. This is the razor's edge. 10 days of ceasefire. 5 days until the Iran deadline, a 15-year nuclear gap to close. And missile launchers being quietly extracted from underground bunkers, one dump truck load at a time. The juice versus the squeeze, one final time. The juice if Trump's 10th ceasefire is the real thing, Israel and Lebanon begin a peace framework for the first time in 43 years. Iran and the U.S. close the nuclear gap at a second round of talks before April 21st. The Hormuz blockade lifts as the deal is signed. Oil prices fall. A generation of Middle Eastern conflict moves toward resolution. And Donald Trump can, with some credibility, claim the most ambitious foreign policy accomplishment of any American president since the Camp David Accords. The squeeze if it isn't, Iran's missile cities complete their reconstitution. The 10-day Lebanon ceasefire collapses on day 4 when Hezbollah fires and Israel responds. The second Iran talks fail because the Israeli action gives Tehran a pretext to walk out. April 21st passes with no deal and no extension. The U.S. resume strikes against a target set that is, in some meaningful ways, stronger than it was when the ceasefire started, and a war that has already killed more than 3,300 people in Iran, 2,100 in Lebanon, and 13 Americans resumes, with no end state in sight and no plan for what victory actually looks like. Which scenario unfolds depends on 5 days of diplomacy, one 10-day ceasefire holding, and a nuclear number somewhere between 5 and 20. 5 days. Let's see who blinks. Subscribe, share. Whatever happens between now and April 21st, we cover every hour of it.